Around 100 kilometers above us lies the Kármán line. It's generally accepted as the altitude where Earth ends and outer space begins. It's never been a hard boundary, but that line is getting fuzzier as advances in space and satellite technology make what's beyond intertwined with life on Earth. So much so that tensions and conflicts that play out on the ground are also reflected up in orbit. And outer space, in turn, is shaping up to be a potential battlefield. In fact, the U.S. Space Force says China is now practicing satellite dogfighting maneuvers to expand its space capabilities. So, what will future space wars look like? And who is getting ready for conflict on the final frontier? I'm Divya Gopalan, and this is Connected on Taiwan Plus. To understand the scope of military operations in outer space, we are now joined from Washington, D.C. by Gregory Miller, the Dean of Space Education for the United States Space Force, a professor of military and security studies at Air University, and an adjunct professor at SAIS Johns Hopkins University. Thank you so much for being part of the program. To start with, could you give us a very quick overview of why space is now becoming such a critical issue for national security?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, first of all. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight. So on a purely military scale, space is the ultimate high ground. For centuries, military planners and strategists have been looking for advantages over their adversary, and high ground is one of those advantages that's sort of persistent in war, and space provides that to the battlefield. It provides surveillance, intelligence, reconnaissance, communications, a whole host of benefits to a military commander or strategist. But it also is critically important to us on a day-to-day basis, just in our everyday life, from navigation, the GPS that helps us get around in our cars, to our cell phones, to even things that we maybe don't tie to space, getting money out of a bank or gas out of a gas station, purchases at a store. All of that is tied to things that we do in space. You've also got a lot of our weather tracking science over climate change. I mean, almost every part of our lives is touched by space in some way, shape, or form. So it's becoming increasingly important for not just the military, but for all of us.
Right. Back in the day, I would say decades ago, it was quite clear who was ahead in the space race, who had the advantage in space. But as you said now, satellites, every country has some interest in it. Is it clear now who has the upper hand in space, or who's ahead, or who has the most advanced space technology?
It depends on how you're measuring it. If you're just looking at total numbers of satellites versus how many launches, whether you're looking at states purely or also looking at commercial actors within the states, SpaceX is probably leading everybody just in terms of numbers of satellites, but is that really the same thing as the United States leading? You've got different countries, India, Japan, launching missions to the moon and other places. So it's hard to say who's in the lead. It's a lot of people have argued that it's becoming more democratized because the price of getting into space is coming down. The technology is more widely available. And so it is harder to know who's in the lead because everybody's kind of starting to get more and more involved, especially beyond or compared to just 10 years ago.
The U.S. Space Force was established in 2019. Why was that, or why did the U.S. see that as necessary? And are other countries, or how are other countries emulating that?
There were a number of reasons. Space was seen as growing increasingly important. That for all the reasons that I laid out before. It was not necessarily given the priority under the Air Force that a lot of people thought it deserved, especially in its growing requirements and importance. It's also, there was a security side of it. There was the perception that the ability to deter violence or attacks in space or to defend space assets was important enough that it required its own service. And other states, some have followed suit, some have given greater priority to space forces or put more emphasis on the space part of their air and space forces. And so everyone has sort of recognized that it's becoming more important. And there's a plus and a negative to that. It is increasing the likelihood of conflict that maybe nobody wants, but it also is something that a lot of states see as necessary for securing their interests in space.
And speaking of conflicts, before we go to the idea of national conflicts in space, you've written about non-state threats in space like space pirates or geosynchronous guerrillas. Can you explain? And how much of a reality is it that these, commercial interests could become a threat?
I think it's a reality. We going back to early days of ocean-going vessels, you had pirates, you had actors who were looking to make a profit off of commerce. And I think that's a real possibility. I don't think it's something we're going to see in the next couple of years. But again, as space becomes more democratized, as it becomes cheaper to get into space, I think you are going to see opportunities to take advantage of, especially once we start to have commerce in space. I think a more likely scenario would be rogue states, actors who aren't necessarily as dependent on space as the rest of us, who see an opportunity to take advantage of the vulnerabilities that we have if they were to attack our space interests. I think that's a much more likely scenario in the next 5-10 years than the space pirates that I've written about. But commerce has a tendency to bring about those who want to get an easy score. And so if space becomes a resource and a source of commerce, as a lot of people are investing and believing that it will, then I think we will see those kinds of illicit activities.
And speaking of activities that some would say are questionable, the U.S. has called recent maneuvers by China, or satellite maneuvers, dogfighting. What do you make of that?
I think that's one of the things that we have a tendency to do in space is draw parallels to things that are familiar to us. And so, again, Space Force has been our space forces were a part of the Air Force for a long time. And so we tend to fall back on those kinds of parallels. We draw a lot of parallels when we talk about space studies, space policy, space strategy to maritime history and maritime strategy. It's kind of familiar to us to draw those analogies or those parallels to space. There's an upside and a downside to that. It is familiar to us. It does help us kind of relate to a domain that none of us live in, that very few people have ever transited through or experienced. And so it's hard for us to understand really what it's like. And dogfighting maybe is the closest analogy to what we've seen some less than helpful actors participate in space.
So in that case, what do we know about China's interests in space? Because China is developing counter space capabilities, including laser and kinetic kill vehicles. What do we know about how much it's trying to push those boundaries in space, and what does that mean for what we see right now as far as the world order goes, or keeping the status quo on Earth?
Yeah, I mean, one of the nice things about being an academic is I'm afforded the opportunity to, say on the one hand and then on the other hand, I don't have to necessarily make national security decisions. I can provide multiple perspectives. And one of the things that I try to relay to our students in the Space Force School here is that we really don't know what China's interests are. On the one hand, it looks like China is acting aggressively. They're doing things that we would expect an aggressive state to do. On the other hand, they're also doing things that we would expect a state that is concerned about its own security to do. And so it's really hard to know, and China doesn't know what U.S. interests are or why we do the things that we do. And so one of my concerns is that we're going to get into conflicts that neither of us really wants, that don't benefit either of us. And it's a function of misunderstanding, misperception, miscommunication, rather than either state actually having hostile intentions towards each other. But again, we don't know, and the national security professionals in both countries have to kind of prepare for the worst because that is their job. There are international laws about what kinds of activities you can do in space, in terms of getting too close to each other, having certain nuclear weapons are prohibited in space, at least in orbit, and so there are sort of rules of the road, but they're not particularly strong. They're not bound by the kind of precedent that you had, again, going back to other kinds of parallels. There, you don't have the hundreds of years of activity in the maritime domain to enforce those norms and rules that you have in space. And so it's still fairly new. The Outer Space Treaty is over a half century old now, but it is sort of out of date in a number of ways. It doesn't include commercial actors, at least to the extent that we probably need to have laws regarding their activities. And so, long-winded answer to your question is there are rules, there are norms, but they're hard to enforce, and they kind of are enforced when the states view them in the state's interest. And other than that, states can do what they want.
Now, here on Earth, defense has changed so much, has transformed so much, and advanced due to the digital space we're seeing. It's no longer physical warfare on the ground and boots on the ground. You've also got cyber warfare, and there are defenses against that. Are there any systems being developed or in existence that defend space assets?
I couldn't get into the details, even if I had that information. I'm sure it's classified. There are obviously a lot of people writing about information warfare, cyber attacks, not just on their own, but particularly against space interests. There's a long history, not a long history, relatively short history, but a couple decades now of cyber attacks against, for example, satellites, ground stations that receive the signals from satellites. And so actors that don't even necessarily have access to space can still, through cyber, influence the kinds of communications that we have to have from space in order to either get a GPS signal or any kind of communications or navigation signal.
It's often thrown about that the next frontier in warfare is the final frontier. Conflict at the final frontier. What do you think that's going to look like?
Conflict in space. I think it's a couple of different things. There's a debate over whether the next big conflict will start in space or simply escalate into space. I think we're seeing in the Russia-Ukraine case that space is playing a role, and that actors who want to shut down the capabilities of another state might target their space interests. I think that cyber is, as I said, it's already been used, and so that's a likely scenario. But again, it'll be interesting, and I say interesting from an academic point of view, not so much from an operator's point of view. It'll be interesting to see what those next conflicts are, because on the one hand, you have this norm against creating debris. Countries that are dependent on space are concerned about the Kessler syndrome, essentially debris that just continuously increases and eventually makes the orbit unusable by anybody. I think all of us who are dependent on space recognize the dangers of even cyber attacks that make satellites unusable and essentially dead in orbit. And so the types of conflicts we're likely to see, hopefully, will not muck up the orbits, not make space unusable, that they'll be sort of short duration, maybe blind a satellite while it's over a country's territory or over battlefields, those kinds of things that are not necessarily permanent. But I don't know. It's like asking somebody in the 1930s, what is the next war going to look like? I mean, we can make guesses based on the past wars, based on the technology that we have today. But we're really bad about predicting next conflicts, even who's going to be in those next conflicts. And so I'm always reluctant to really give predictions about that type of thing.
On that note, that is something that is Taiwan is very concerned about. Whatever the next conflict could look like, and especially Taiwan relies a lot at the moment on externally for its communications. So given China's growing space capabilities, which includes over 450 satellites and anti-satellite weapons, what steps do you think Taiwan needs to take to safeguard itself?
That's tricky. I mean, you have a situation where just geography, geopolitics, the politics of the region make it very difficult for Taiwan to be able to defend itself. I think the advice I would give is the same advice I give our students in the United States: is partners and allies. The more states that you have to support you, to back you up, whether it's a formal alliance or trade partners or whatever it might be, arms sales. Those kinds of relationships are often the best means of securing your defense if you're not able to secure your defense on your own. And so, that would probably be the best advice I could give is secure those partnerships and maintain those strong relations where you can.
At the moment, are there any limits to how much a country can put up in space, be it satellites or other types of advanced technologies?
Sure. I mean, most countries still are limited by technology and cost. And even the spacefaring powers, US, Russia, China, India, Japan, South Korea, European Union, they're limited in a number of ways. Cost and budget obviously is one. But even in the United States, launch capabilities is a limiting factor. There's only so many places that you can launch from, and there are schedules that sometimes get backed up because of weather or other things. And so I know that's a priority in a number of countries to figure out new ways to put stuff up in space to make our constellations more resilient and more easily replaced in the event that they are attacked, or even just become unusable for over their lifespan ends and you want to replace them. And so there's a number of reasons why states can't just do whatever they want to do in space. And technology still is a factor. There's still a limited number of countries that can launch from their own territory, and that we call native space launch capabilities. And even those countries are limited by a number of things. Like I said, actually launch facilities as well as budgets.
So it's basically self-imposed as opposed to, at the moment, an international framework stopping them from advancing.
Yeah, there's nothing that internationally limits a state from launches. I mean, there are rules about having to register what you're launching so that we don't create debris by essentially launching into the same orbits or the same positions. There are the International Telecommunications Union does register slots in geo orbit, and so there are things that can kind of limit what you can do, where you can put satellites. But in terms of just numbers of launches, there's not an international limit. A lot of that is domestic. technological capabilities, or sometimes environmental regulations also can play a role.
And finally, your book Sun Tzu in Space, Sun Tzu, all the whole ideology of, I guess, winning without fighting, draws on history and strategy. So what would you say is the key takeaway from that in order to prevent any kind of conflict in space or deter a future space war?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it actually goes back to one of the first questions you asked me is about China's interest. What Sun Tzu says is you have to know your adversary and you have to know yourself. And I think, unfortunately, for the last several centuries in international politics, we traditionally have trouble understanding what our adversaries want. And so sometimes we get into conflicts that could have been avoidable if we had communicated with one another. And I think that in many ways is the lesson of Sun Tzu is you have to know what your capabilities are, what your interests are, but you can't just stop there. You also have to think about what your allies want, what their interests are. And, the states that you see as adversaries or competitors or rivals, can you compete without conflict? Can you have competition without having to go to war? And hopefully that's something that we can still do in space, even though human history doesn't necessarily illustrate that.
Should Taiwan follow in the footsteps of countries like the US, Russia, China, and India and strengthen its hand in space warfare? And what about others? Share your thoughts in the comments section below and click the video beside me for a discussion of India's preparation to keep its interests in space secure. And hit the subscribe button and the notification bell for more stories on tech and business from Connected.